alternate histories. So we're going to have 3 presentations, not 4 this morning, as far as I can tell, which gives us a little bit more time for questions. So I'd like to go ahead and invite Joanna and Fernando to get started.
Thank you. I don't know why my presentation is not on this one. Hello, we are Fernando and Joanna. I am a fine art conservator, now trying to be time-based media conservator or variable media art conservator. I haven't decided yet my name. And this is Fernando, he's an art historian. We have been working together for a couple of months now, and we want to introduce you our project we've been trying to set up over the last 2 months. And Fernando's going to start, so I apologize for our English. We are going to do our best to speak a better English, but anytime that you don't understand, you just raise your hand, and we can do another methodology so you can get all our ideas.
Thanks. Good morning. This paper discusses how, in the Mexican context, the historical survival, preservation and transmissions of media arts works have been achieved not by the labor of institutions, but instead by the transmission practices generated by artists. Over the years, museums and galleries, instead of collective and actively document media artworks, have been giving priority to exhibition practices. While cultural institutions are exclusively works on preparing temporary exhibition and shows, our practice genres have been developing practices for transferring their knowledge and finding ways to transmit the history of development of media art. Such practices include the documentation of artworks and their trajectories, that is, extensive documentation about how the artworks have been made and how they have circulation. The creation and maintenance of electronic and physical archives, which bring together documents, recording, press clips, leftovers, and traces of artworks. The organization of workshops and curatorial projects for sharing knowledge about the modes of making, of ways of doing. Our premise is that through these modes of transmission, what has been kept are not frozen, static, and obsolete art objects, but instead an active knowledge of modes of doing art. Given this scenario, we would like to propose the notions of art circulation patterns as a methodological tool to study the modes of doing media art. The approach aims at moving away from those narratives that interpret media art as an immaterial and propose to understand the materiality of media artworks from a relational perspective. Historically, academics have been warring narratives around media art histories based upon 2 models. One influenced by the modernism, and the other related with the conceptual art. Within the first model, art unfolds a symbol of identity nationalism, therefore, as part of our cultural heritage. Modernism gives value to our works according with their medium specificity, thus privileging conventional ways of doing art as well as traditional forms of art such as painting, drawing and print making. In opposition to this discourse, conceptual art perspective claims that art must have a political function and it must show resistance to be part of the institution. From this point of view, art tends to move from object-based works towards less immaterial artworks. This appropriation addresses art production from a traditional dualistic scheme, such as materiality and discourse, form and content, physical and virtual. As a result, media arts has been interpreted and has an ephemeral, conceptual, and immaterial form of art. However, media art cannot be studied from neither of these two premises, because it refers to new and different ways of modes of doing art. The giving a little bit of perspective about development of media art practice in Mexico, we would like to point out two different periods of aesthetics.
According with Fernando's studio, the history of the development of media arts can be divided in two main periods in Mexico. One period that starts around the 70s, when artists start experimenting using technologies, what they call technology, that is fax, photocopies, they start doing electrographies and things like that. But they still keep using or framing their work in the same old disciplines. They want to paint using technological tools. They want to do drawings using technological. So they don't want to create a different discipline. They just want to keep doing what they know how to do, but with different tools. But then in 1995, they opened a new center that is called Multimedia Centro Multimedia Center, which was massive investment in the government, and they put this place in a school of art, and they give all the artists all the machines that you can imagine. So they start experimenting with robotics, with virtual reality. So that generation started making things different, thinking different, not thinking in painting using Photoshop, but actually thinking in connecting, in creating other type of realities. An example of this is, let me see if we can see this video. Well, this is one of, it's very, it's from the 90s, so you can understand why the image is so small. But this is an archaeological place called Montalban in Oaxaca. So it's very interesting how artists, they started using these technologies for still documenting something that is heritage, because somehow you were allowed to use these tools that were brandly new, as soon as you still keep being Mexican and being national and being, this is us, being super modern, using technologies to document archaeological places. But I want to go back to this idea. When I met Fernando, he was working with this idea of patrones de relación artística. I don't know how to get back. These art circulation patterns was the way that we translate that. Patrones artísticos de circulación. It means that in Mexico, institutions, they didn't collect early technological artworks. Most of the artwork, they have survived or they have stayed in artists' own archives. They never, institutions, they never buy all installation, video installation or anything like that, because they didn't consider that art. So artists start keeping those elements in their own houses and sharing those with other artists that they need a TV, so they borrow the TV and installation and start moving. So he said that that in media art in Mexico, you cannot study media art as in other countries where they have collections in these massive museums and you can see non-pack being preserved. We don't have those collections, but we have artist archives. And in those artist archives, they have all types of documents about these works. So when we can do is a study how these works have circulated through different exhibitions, through different moments and different versions. And then for me it was important because as a conservator, I can establish a point in this different trajectory of circulation where I can reinstall the work. So I can ask an artist about one version that he likes in this old circulation pattern and try to reestablish the materiality, because materiality, according with Street Sorensen and this idea, is something that is performed, that can be rebuilt, that is relational, is created with actants, creates certain type of relations. So for me it's important because if we don't have works, still we have documents that allowed us to create this pattern to allow the work to be installed without make a copy or something that is less important than the original one. It's a version that keeps circulating in this pattern. So it's part of the work somehow. And I use this idea to promote in the conservation field in Mexico, because we have very strong ideas about what is original and what is not original. That this is, we want to keep all the old TVs and all the computers because we can. And most of the media artists, they say, we don't have problems of obsolescence. And you see their houses and they have computers from the 90s. Of course they don't have because they still have the computers. But the moment they want to work circulating in different places, those computers won't be there. So we need to find forms to keep those works circulating in different levels. But the problem in Mexico is that we don't have conservators. In the School of Conservation, we don't have media art conservation or audiovisual preservation or something like that. So what we've been doing is working with those artists, learning from their techniques, because for them, their works are not frozen. They are keep working and they are translating their works in modes of doing. So you can see a very young guy doing circuits from the 90s because Arcángel Constantini is teaching him how to do it. So what artists are doing, they are not creating legacies based on objects, but in ways of thinking and doing. And we believe that is a strong way to preserve works. They are not objects, but they are forms where you can keep creating and sharing knowledge about what is media art. I want to show you some. No sé. For instance, this is one of the young Mexican artists working with modes of doing or different ways of doing media art, Gilberto Esparza. Well, it's in Spanish.
Ser como una especie de fauna urbana.
But it's very interesting because all the videos of artists, when they start speaking about their work, they present their work conceptually, then technically, and then they show you how to do it. So you get the whole idea. It's not that they are focused on, this is the circuit, this is, oh, my concept is very concept. No. They know that the work has to function, but has a concept, and they have to share the knowledge.
Programaciones.
And as you can see, they don't have massive studios or anything like that. They usually work at home. They get some grants from funding from institutions for working on this, but most of the time they organize workshops where they ask very little money to new students to learn, and the students, they help them to create these new objects. So it's a different level of organization and sharing knowledge about how to preserve these works or these modes of doing our works. And yeah, well, we couldn't find this one. We want to close with this. See? With this image, this is one of the pioneers of media art in Mexico. His work has never been in big museums or anything like that. He's just a teacher, and he's been teaching how to deal with video and with new technologies to new students. And he was very rich. He has all type of machines, and all his classes start with the first video camera, and he teaches you how to use the first video camera. So you can get an idea, because we don't have ways to compare what has been happening in the development art in Mexico. So he teaches you why these works are different, because now they are digital and you cannot use analog technologies. But he teaches you from doing and from touching the stuff. So new artists in Mexico are learning like that. And we believe that is a preservation strategy somehow to keep alive most like oral traditions. Like we are used to that. We know that most of our things, they have survived because your grandma told you how to do stuff. So that kind of sharing is the way that media arts are being preserved in the national context, at least in Mexico. Thank you very much.
Perhaps we can take a few questions. If you, well, Srajana is setting up. If you move a little over, you can probably already get started. So I think we have in general seen a shift to kind of documenting these modes of doing art, as you put it, which is, of course, one of the challenges that new media art or any type of work that is more focused on process poses. So I think in general, I would say prompted by new media art, museums, institutions, archives are now paying a lot more attention to documentation of modes of working, of exhibitions themselves. Katja Kwastek has talked about Hito Steil's concept of circulationism, your art circulation patterns. One of the questions I had was whether there is any effort on the part of the government, for example, to make these archives that you pointed out more accessible, if in the first place institutions aren't collecting and preserving the work. Is there an effort to provide more access to the archive?
Yes, the last, I will say 5, maybe even 10 years, it's been a boom of documentation centers in museums, because they didn't have an art collection, but they are somehow, they have the money to buy artist archives. But they started buying these archives in a very low amount, and then artists decide, this is my work of, I mean, I'm not an artist working for doing archives, but still it's my work of documenting the work, my work and the work of many others for years, so I deserve a little bit more. But most of these documentation centers are being fit by these artist archives. So artist archives, they donate their archives. Institution digitalize everything and try to put it in an open platform so many people can visit, to have access to those documents, and then the artist take their archives. That's the way in the museum that I'm working works like that, because they didn't collect anything, they didn't have money to buy any type of work, so now they are asking all these performance people who was able to document their work to give all their archives. We want to digitalize your archive. You don't get any money. We get all the rights to distribution and diffusion, but everybody will know your work. So somehow we want to help those artists to use their own tools. So use Wikipedia to make accessible their archives, because no one can guarantee that these institutions are going to take care of those archives. So we are worried that this boom of documentation centers will take that labor from artists, and the institution has not as we see, has not all the imagination to make those, to understand the ontology of those archives, how they were built, why those documents are put it together. So it's better if the artists find a way to put those documents online, or to create a way to share that ontology with others. So the meaning of that archive is not dilute in these institutional ways to cataloging and to order stuff.
Yeah.
I have two questions. One, thank you for your presentation, of course. Two questions. One, what was the artist's name you showed at the end? You didn't mention his name.
Andrea Di Castro.
Andrea Di Castro. I find that a really interesting approach to actually teaching students to use renegade media, if you want to, because it has an interesting question also of the embodiment of knowledge of media in it. And the second question, that's more of a comment and a question in regard to his name. The second question was, are you interconnecting with different networks that have been active on that front for many, many years?
Yeah.
Because there's obviously DOCAM, you know.
Yeah. We've been using all those tools to teach them.
So you're not just two heroes doing
No,
this
no,
on
no,
your
no,
own.
no.
You're actually, obviously. So
Yeah.
I was wondering about these networks.
No, we've
if you
been
can speak
training
about that.
like a couple of weeks ago. I was attending this meeting of emulation. We've been taking Benfino Radin to teach us how to do some digital forensic tools. So we want to learn so we can share the knowledge with these artists. Artists, they know everything. So, but our worry is that many information is not very well documented, so we can somehow miss these different versions of the work. And we are interested in he as an historian and me as a conservator, trying to keep the original. I wanted to be able to trace these different versions. So where we are learning for them how to preserve, but to try to them to be not to stop them, but to keep some kind of methodology that can be followed for our historians and new students in the future, so they can understand all these behaviors and embodiments of the one idea.
It's kind of making knowledge available.
Yes.
Right, and also conserving the contingency of the legacies of the people involved.
Exactly.
Right.
That's what I like, because I've been here, in all this .com and all stuff. Those all projects are based in preserving a work of art, and it's quite difficult for first because we don't have a work on art in a collection, but then because it's easy for us to learn how to do it, like do it yourself, or teaching ways to keep those embodiments alive for the rest of their life is better if it works organically somehow.
Any other question for you? Yeah, Katrin.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you very much. That's really interesting. Concerning the Centro Multimedia that you mentioned, that was founded in 1995, because that was more or less contemporary to the ZKM in Karlsruhe, because it was a European attempt or German attempt to institutionalize media art. Some people are very skeptical of the art that has been produced there, and I heard somehow that you were also slightly skeptical about the art that has been produced in the Central Multimedia, but still the ZKM has an important role in preserving some of the early works of media art in Germany. So what's the role of this Central now in your contemporary situation?
That's the way I met Fernando, because Fernando was working at the Centro Multimedia and he was trying to do his PhD dissertation about the Centro Multimedia. So he wanted to see the works, and they said, we don't have works. We have some documents, and all the documents, they were stored in this, they were not even floppies. It's something behind the floppies, like cartridge. So he has no access to those documents, and he was, I need a conservator, a media conservator. So he contacted me, and it was very interesting because he was keeping the CD-ROMs like the works. Like, I have this, I bring this from the Centro Multimedia, as thinking that on the CD-ROM was the media artwork, and then even try to explain them that there are different information carriage, and those are just carriers carriers of information. They are not actual the work. Was difficult. Well, answering your question, Multimedia has no works collected. They only have documents, and the centro is almost closed. There is no people there. All the machines are not working, and I'm speaking for Fernando because he gets a little bit nervous, and I get nervous that he cannot express all his ideas, but I know what he wants to say. When he was working on that, he said that Mexico has this way of being that he wants to be in every part of life. If the word is globalization, he wants to be part of the globalization and make this economical treaties with other countries. So at that time in the 90s, everything was being digital and being technological. So they found this place with machines that nobody knew how to use. They don't have instructions because most of them, they were German or in English. So they have people that is working there because they use the same people working in the same old school. So they don't even speak English. They didn't know how to turn on the computer. They bring people from McLuhan program to teach them how to use the stuff because not all artists were allowed to use this fancy facility. So it was a very weird place, Centro Multimedia. After a few years, Andrea Di Castro started inviting his students, and that's how Multimedia get this international view, because new students started doing stuff. Because thanks to Andrea Di Castro, that place it was not just a white, how they call it, these museums that doesn't work for anything, that they are just massive with nothing inside. And Multimedia was like that, massive with big machines, but nobody knew how to use it. And Andrea Di Castro give that turn to Centro Multimedia, but now it's almost dead, and the funding is gone, and there is no people there working.
Okay. Hopefully we can continue. Thanks again. Hopefully we can continue the conversation at the end. So could you? Thank you. Okay, so next up is Srajana KAIKINI.
So you can hear me? Okay. So I'm Srajana. I'm a curator. I'm currently pursuing my PhD, which is rather delayed. But okay, I'm just going to read from the paper. I apologize for that, but yeah, I hope the thought process is clear and we can have a discussion after this. Under the larger discourse of philosophy's engagement with art, my research presently is interested in looking at philosophy as artistic practice, trying to get at a new understanding of the nature of curatorial today. So I'm using the term philo-curatorial at the outset to define the gesture of this presentation. So I want to base my presentation in that gesture and to highlight this entanglement. This paper will attempt a philo-curatorial mediation between certain concepts around contemporary new media art, taking instances from artistic practices of two artists, Shilpa Gupta, and with some help from Rux Media Collective. Both are colleagues, artists of Indian origin who have emerged as critical contemporary figures in present times. In the context of our contemporary practice, the image can be said to have emerged as a reigning affect in art's relentless attempts at using new and thoughtful media to express itself. In this context, Gupta's work can be seen as an aesthetic that is performative, political, and literal, while Raks's oeuvre emerges through a self-proclaimed mesh of images and texts. Both artists signpost the condition of the cosmopolitan contemporary artist who is negotiating two fields of conversation. One that is regionally familiar, geographically local, while the other is cosmopolitan, virtual, and cosmolocal. These works emerge from different traditions of craft, techniques, and material histories, and personal forms of expression, but yet manage to transcend into a wider conversation globally. The material here comes from a personal process, sometimes includes humor, wit, and drama, and makes itself available to the global art audience. As it is quite evident from these works, much of this conversation is possible or made possible because of an ever-renewing media practice and the technology that is employed in the making of these works. Critic Nancy Ajania, in her essay on Gupta's work, observes, Gupta rarely asks you to exit the comforts of normality and enter the hallowed space of art. Instead, her works are designed to be activated like Wi-Fi hotspots, invisible zones that allow your internet connections to snap into life in a coffee bar or an airport lounge. While taking a brief walk down the corridor to the washroom, you trip on a sensor, are assailed by a disembodied voice making racial slurs. Browsing casually through a religious website, you may trigger off an array of gun-toting monks, incongruous among icons and ritual instructions, clones of the artist flashing like runtime errors. Turning a corner in a bookstore, you might find yourself in a shop selling takeaway kidneys, or else you might find the artist in not-so-cool places like Bombay's crowded railway compartments, selling bottles of blood, guilt cleansers offered to baffled women commuters. The artist herself has said elsewhere that her media is embodied with certain default properties. It is interactive, participatory, and time-based, and it has a default politics. Being non-consumable, mass-produced. It is distributive, overlaps with other print, and so basically it's not just a medium, but its context, role, and function that she's interested in. As we are affronted by the highly readable, understandable, and literal work of Gupta, we are also simultaneously invited into a conscious slipping away from the direct image and its object towards a speculative mode of experiencing the work, when beyond the given work, discourse is made possible around the work only by a lateral engagement with its image, like this presentation is doing. So basically, I'm taking images of her work from her website, and I'm taking images from the catalog of Raks's work, Raks's exhibition that happened recently. And that's the only way I can make this presentation, is using their image. So the literal image thus confronts the viewer with a blatant challenge to misread it. Therefore, in the case of Gupta's work, I argue that there is a conscious need to slip away from the first available and most widely circulated reading of her work as being politically charged, and to look at it operating as a communicative image in the world, providing us an opportunity to converse. Ronci, in this book, Future of Image, talks about the alternative images. The image he says refers to nothing else. So it is not a function of a certain technical medium, but more of an operation system. Imageness, therefore, is a regime of relations between elements and functions. His engagement with the politics of images and aesthetics arises under the overarching question of what does it mean when we say that there is no longer any reality but only images. One finds resonant parallels in the metaphysics of Advaita. They are the non-dualist philosophers in the Indian tradition. One of the major proponents was Shankara, wherein the conception of reality is perceived as an error. The world, which is apparently real, appears to our so-called ignorant vision through a veil, a shielding of the true nature of the really real. This veil then manifests through artifice or technology as an image of the world. So the world as image is a veiled absence of the reality at its core. But the philosophy does not discount the vision of the world. It only acknowledges that whatever we engage with is merely an image in error from the original, and we continue to live in that error. The liberation in such aspects, because most of Indian traditional philosophy, the telos is liberation. So the liberation in such aspects comes from the knowledge of this fact, that the image exists in error. The tradition holds many cues to our contemporary discourse on image and its material. And here I hope you are sort of sensing the flow of, I'm not talking about image as a visually predominant mode at all, because if you consider the concept of imageness from a non-Western perspective, it is a synesthetic, all-embodied conception. It's not dualistic. It's extending the same line of thought, then, into our perceptual world, our regime of perception is but limited by our limits of perception. Our horizon is as expansive as the limits of our imagination. Philosopher Sundar Sarukkai observes how our experiences are essentially constructed out of our limits of language. And this limit, this condition of having to settle with token and types to engage with the world, is the most approximate that we could get to any attempt at understanding the nature of image material in contemporary practice. The opaque image, or the literal image, is a concept I would like to engage here. Apart from the fact that images are archives of processes behind their making, they're also veils and sheets, physical entities that allow entry points into the processes that they represent, at the same time disallowing complete entry into the work. So we are accosted with an opacity, which often accompanies works which are extremely lucid and intelligible. This limit condition, or the definitive expression of art, then provides the beginning point for creative speculation and the active mental participation on part of the audience. This is one of her earlier works. I'm mostly referring to Gupta's earlier works when she was just beginning to dabble with technology, and she was also grappling with her identity as a new media artist. Much of Gupta's works can be attributed to have that literal quality to it, and with literal, there is no sense of pejorative. It is a quality definition, making at once explicit the content that constitutes the work. So there is a certain sense of hyper-resemblance reflecting or resonating with Baudrillard's discourse on simulacra. So there's this work is called There's No Explosive in This, and as you can see, it's a set of bags with that written on it. It's an extremely explicit, direct work in terms, and she intervenes into the public space. So we have actors moving in the city with these bags. So the multiplicities of imageness consists, among many possibilities, the obvious image, the non-image, the de-image, the anti-image, and so on. Many of Gupta's early works use the trope of this literality to convey a commonsensical yet subtle strain of thought behind it. For instance, the literal quality of her work finds resonance with Rancière's engagement with literariness. And literariness has a political import which moves towards a more egalitarian aesthetics, wherein the excess of words is a move towards a more equal aesthetic regime, where art practice is emancipated from hierarchical notions of genre and style. Rancière specifically makes a point that art is first of all an idea of art, and the literarity as being a specific link between a system of meaning of words and a system of visibility of things is essentially what makes literal in contemporary art. Also a political move towards the experience of art, which is emancipated from the regimes of the knowledge project. This leads us to the question of this paper: what then is the materiality of an image? If we are to understand that the literal in artworks and explicit gestures evoke an opaque response in the viewer, then this opacity is followed by an immediate speculative move on part of the viewer. The resistance is subverted by thought, language, and meaning. Thus, I argue that when we confront the works that embody statements, where the aesthetic regime lies not in the experience of the work, but in the gestures that they embody, these works are therefore not objects in the strictest sense, but images whose prime material is language. The artwork is made by the word. The artwork also thus becomes an even-shaped whole. The sentence is not the sayable, the image is not the visible, the sentence image intends to undo the representative between text and image. It's a line from Rancière's book. In another, okay, yeah, so you can, the work on this side. In another work, Gupta displays two heated iron panels mounted on the wall, and the temperature of the room is controlled, such that there is a controlled heat zone created around the work. And the viewer's encounter with it takes the form of being subsumed by warmth, at first overwhelming and ultimately turning oppressive. Rancière's idea of the sentence image, through which he elaborates on the close resonance between poetry and image, provokes us to question the voice of imagination. If an image can speak for itself, then how do we see or hear or smell or touch its language? Does language exist purely in the domain of these five senses? And even among these, would the phonetic then connect the easiest to the visible? There's a phrase, "Ut pictura poesis" in Latin, which translates as is painting, so is poetry. It's an old one. So there's a certain visibility attached to words. Words make something visible, yet not present, seen by way of narration and description. Words make seen what does not pertain to the visible by reinforcing or muffling the expression of an idea, by making an emotion felt. We must then ask if text is a language of material, or is language the material of text? I apologize for all these questions, but they're in my head, and I hope you think with me. And then the question that is questioning these two is image then the first material of language? Image, again, not visual, but image instead. When you think of something, you have an image. Thus, the impression or expression of a thought is in constant tussle with a certain hegemony of the visible and the legible, which welcomes healthy contention. The juxtapositions of visuals, images, texts, sounds, and voices leads to a loss of foothold on commensurability. There is an aporia reached in the gap between material presences and meaning. So there's a dialectical encounter, as we have seen it also in the surrealist cadaver exquis. There's an encounter where incompatible elements organizes a clash, presenting a strangeness of the familiar, coupling heterogeneous elements which reveal secrets, entail high-pitched eccentric renditions of the power of the image. Thus, the gesture and technology that underlies most contemporary expressions of practice perform in a similar manner as of sentencing. They sentence the contemporary artwork to make possible a certain affective experience for the art audience to emerge out of this sentencing. So I'll end with two other concepts. One is of the inexhaustible image and the other of the absent image. Okay. Now, as we swing from the condition of strict limits to the condition of limitlessness, we encounter the inexhaustible image. This is the image that is like a crucible for infinity. The more you seek from it, the more it gives and the more it grows and proliferates. The D-image or the loop and the loop are two such technical modes through which contemporary work turns inexhaustible, tries to turn inexhaustible. In her Gupta's work called Shadows, visitors walk, it's an interactive display where visitors walk in front of the projection and their shadow becomes part of the visual projection, and then it proliferates as and when. And this has been done in many other works as well. The interactive work asks the viewer to click on the figures, and these figures then seem to, there's another work, move, bend, move as well, imitating and giving the viewer a sense of having some playful control over the figure. The artist says, dumbed in a capitalistic society, we enjoy being programmed, and that sort of accompanies this work. These two works in juxtaposition inherently reveal an urge to proliferate and oppress. They line the communist regime of images, wondering whether to resemble or not to resemble. So, with this proliferation of the individual, multiple types and copies of alterity, there ceases to be a singular Gupta. There is a likeness, a Shilpa Gupta-ness, if you say, created by the decentering of the image and replication. So as Rancière says, the image therefore refers to two different things. Firstly, that there is the simple relationship that produces the likeness of an original and never inherently a faithful copy. And the second being the interplay of operations that produces the alteration of resemblance. Thus, the amplification of this optical density of the appearances in real world voices out the crisis of the singular. So, art sustains by duplicity and multiplicity in intermedia. And the second mode is the mode of the shuffle or art on loop, playlist on shuffle, art on loop. The notion of art in a media that is temporal necessitates it to resort to looping itself on an endless node, restructuring moments of encountering the work of art and overall art effect. To be on loop, to repeat oneself continually, to dissolve the moment of encounter into a timeless mumble, is a new mode of experiencing an idea by expounding on the stammers of a mechanized society, giving expression to digital deja vus and the stripping of language of thought from a syntax of communication to a syntax of the impossibility of communication in an over-communicative networked world. This interactive loop keeps slipping into mindless violence, violence which is no longer just a fashion. This can be seen in many of her works, including a work called Singing Cloud and Singing Microphone. There is, okay, I will skip that. So there, as I've explained above, the art effect attains a new coexistence with the actual object of art, wherein the experience is itself an object to be encountered, within which lies or may not lie embedded the second level of encounter or multiple encounters with the art object. Since the experience of the gallery space now turns into an object on its own right, it could be possible to read the affected voice, the disembodied source of the voice, as an attempt to heighten this detachment from experience object, heightens this detachment of the experience object from the subject. The voice or the sound completes the bridge between the subject status to object status. So image and speech find slippery crossovers, and therein lies the faith in the regime of image to present a relation between the sayable and the visible and the invisible. This is the last part. An entity in its absence, thus, could be an example of the most inexhaustible image possible of any event. Absence has been considered as an important metaphysical category in Indian philosophical thought, especially the Nyaya Vaisheshika traditions. They were the materialist, atomist philosophers, wherein absence is primarily a relational category. It occurs in relation to all things present. In contrary to absence as a tool of negation, if we consider it as a positive quality, then we can see how forms such as recollection, memory, technologies of the archival, and even the basic acts of artistic encounters happen in absentia. That is, via constant revisiting, reordering of memory and experience to recollect the moment of artistic encounter with the work. The absent image, therefore, is the most inexhaustible image functioning through the instrument of memory. This condition finds more instances in the very fact that most exhibitions exist in their afterlives through documentation, catalogs, and languages generated around the event. Thank you for your beautiful presentation, because I was like exactly extrapolating on that sort of personal archive mode also in terms of how do you transmit documentation. The latest initiative of hosting exhibitions online is one such response to this new realization that artistic experiences can be embodied even through their images in absentia. This experience being a conceptual one and one that transcends the politics of presence. The life of the curatorial, which I'm still questioning, thus could perhaps dwell in the form of an image, or if you could say, as a sentence image, which not only encompasses meaning and experience from the event as occurred, but also makes possible the very condition of contemporariness by making available its image as a creative repository. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions before we move on to the next presentation. There's so much to unwrap in your talk that we, I guess, could have a Q&A for a long time. I wanted to start with one question. I realize that you see basically philosophy as a curatorial approach in the first place, and that was the premise of what you were doing. But coming back to the practical aspects of curating those images in the broadest sense, how do you see the translations happening there? Are we just dealing with instances of images in an exhibition in a curatorial approach, such as the shuffle mode? Yeah? Or do you actually see a broader curatorial approach emerging from your treatment of images?
Yeah, so that is exactly what I want to unwrap over the next few years, I hope. But I'm trying to look at the philosophy of the curatorial, and curatorial not in terms of a spatial, temporal, at one moment bringing, of course, that is the beginning point of it. But instances, looking at curatorial as a tendency, and then, of course, we have instances of it. We would have translation, critics, the role of the art critic, the role of the playlist maker, the DJ, in everyday life, in terms of the person the patron, the host in a small village would bring people together. So I'm looking at the curatorial as a relational existence. And the relation could happen through regimes of course, artworks of people. And so we are essentially in a curated space in that way. And of course, across time. So I think why I persist on image here is because image at least has a cross-temporal quality, and it's our first access to being contemporary with history as well as the future. So yeah, I see a lot of potential in it, moving beyond the. I mean, I would not want to even differentiate a practical curatorial with philosophy as a practice.
I didn't mean to do that.
Yeah. But yeah, that would be my response to it.
Any other questions?
Thank you. That's really wonderful. I would like Christiane so many things. Thank you. I was wondering if you could perhaps just talk briefly to the association between curating and care, because it seems to me that across the two presentations so far there is a notion of curatorial practice as a practice of social and cultural care.
Yeah.
Which is also the original meaning of the curare of the word. Yeah.
Exactly. But the care in the most relational sense of not just with objects but with people and emotions and sentiments. I think it's become a sentimental practice in a strange way. That's true. I mean, I agree with you, and I think also we must look at the lives of works in terms of artworks as sentimental objects. And I think I'm going towards this entirely vitalist outlook of looking at curating as not just the day of opening, in a very practical example sense, but a life project of, you need not produce work, but you can be a curatorial mind and live with people. So yeah, I think it's essential. It's essential also to come together and have congregations and have more conversations around it. So, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, let's move on to the next presentation, and perhaps we have time in the end. Okay, so next up is Barbara Claussen on the history and representational politics of feminist new media and performance art.
Yes, so I'm going to go back. But somehow, of course, I feel there's so much to say, probably, between the three parties here, and thank you so much for your presentations. I think it's really interesting if we look at terms, and I'll maybe perhaps immediately plug into what you've said at the outset, this question of going to put an image up right away, in the sense of looping, but also opacity. And I feel that is very present within this larger topic of research as a curatorial practice, which has existed, of course, since the 60s, and has a long and vibrant tradition also theoretically with people like Paul O'Neill, et cetera, who've written about this many years. And this question of an accompaniment of engagement, specifically with practices that challenge various forms of media in their choices of expression or reproduction, as well as instances of presentness. And I think both actually meet at a very specific point in recent history, and that is with a kind of revival. I mean, I'm coming from art history. I'm specializing in performance theory and history, but I'm an art historian. I'm not a performance studies expert, nor am I a media studies theorist. So this is, of course, so interesting because many different viewpoints and histories meet. But the main question for me was this renaissance of performance art or of performance-based practices, and also coming along at the same time as with artistic knowledge production and research-based practices, also coming along with relational practices and this concern with the archive and the document kind of merged together at a very specific point, and that is at the end of the 90s, where people also like Claire Bishop have written a lot about this merger of that very specific moment, and where museums and institutions have then at that point started to have departments not just for new media as before, but also where the Department for Performance suddenly comes in various institutions. So the Renaissance, and some of the examples I will show of artists, though, dating back 20 to 30 years before, address that tension of not only the real and its reproduction, but its persistence or insistence within a space that it presents itself as a medium as well as an exhibition space, a real space. The renaissance of performance within and media art within an art world that engages with an increasingly diverse and heterogeneous public, a public that also appears not only in the exhibition space but online and in various instances in public spaces, has found its echo in increased acquisitions of performance-based works, documentary archives and the concern of those, media works, as well as numerous exhibitions, of course, and performance series that are concerned with past and present performance-based practices and relational practices, translated again into various media, such as film, video, slide projections, accessible archives, installations, etc. My outset is from a term understanding of performance as a discursive practice and as a hybrid medium. So I'm not talking about, even though I'm showing you some examples of artists that are very much working, of course, with the presence of their body, I, right now in 2015, understand this practice from a different perspective in that sense of one being hybrid and discourse-based. So just to clarify that as well. And this, of course, these whole waves of interest globally have brought about an institutional awareness towards the performative, and they have led to the founding of curatorial departments specifically addressing that, or the resurgence of various departments engaged in the question of not just conserving video and installation art like the DOCAM project, but also how right now, I'm thinking of Pippa Anderson and various people who are also really concerned with how do we conserve performance-based practices, and how does that then, again, and that's actually, if we're thinking of somebody like Frank Lebovici at the Centre Pompidou, how does that then read back into the ecology of the artwork itself and its contingency as an art form that has always been there as a contingent art form. So this ongoing focus on performance-based, self-reflective practices in parallel in their status of what the mediums they choose, but also the messages that they contain, and the two are not any more separable as only being, this is what you can do with this specific medium if you master its technology, and this is what it carries as a content, so that it actually does overlap in these two areas. And that interest, when it has taken effect, as well as the time and process-based states of existence, as well as outside of the medium. Exhibiting a historical performance, in this case that's my outset from a collection or an archival source. And here I'm going to go back to Joan Jonas and this important image where the image that we see, in this case absolutely, the image that we see that has been chosen to be diffused and reproduced and put out into the world is one where the process of its production is included, and at the same time that process was also part of that performative event of its coming into image, becoming an image. At the same time, the woman behind the camera, Babette Mangold, in this case, her own filmmaker and artist, is kind of redoubled back into the image. So it's this layerness that comes in. And one of my curatorial project was to actually, for this Organic Honey series, which was one of John Jonas's seminal performances in the early 70s and included Vertical Roll and various other projects, is to actually show the entire archive and not just one image, which then leads to 500 different art histories, if you'd want to be polemic, that could be written on that. So any histories that is written, and we will re-show this at DHC in next year in the spring, to actually open up that box between the archive and the performance, and how artists go back and actually always have actively used that in a very, very, very legible and smart ways. The same for Babette Mangold, who now, as the chronicler behind the camera, has become her own, researcher almost of her own work, and has translated that into various forms of installations that, yes, go back and use the photograph, the script, the notebook, the Polaroid, maybe even the literature that she's used at the time. This is not such a, you probably can't see it, it's all the way on the left and the bottom, but also then to kind of make a mise en abîme situation of not just the mode of production, but also of its presentation and of its liveness. So these things kind of overlap with each other. And I think that is a really important moment, because this is not just in the now, but this has always been the case with these works. It's just our understanding of reading of it. I will very quickly say that, of course, for historians, and I'm sure you also have this question all the time, is this question, what happens with the work when it is not just conserved, but that it is spoken about, and then it is constantly changing in that process. And so questions when you exhibit a historical performance or a performance from a collection in an archive, commission a series, ask an artist to engage with a past or present performance work in a collection or that is about to be made, brings up numerous questions, and those are part of an ongoing research. That research is neither new, nor is it a research that will ever end. It is always there, and it always happens in connection. And if there's ever a good historical example, it's probably Variations 5 by John Cage, to really go back in history to show that actuality as well. And the questions are, how can claims of authenticity be discussed, in this case, developed and translated within the setting of an exhibition or various medias it is translated in, or in what ways, and I feel that's a very important part, can an exhibition context, an exhibition could be any, it's not only the white cube, it could be this here too, and any, especially academic institutions. In what ways can that context of exhibiting, showing, acting out, simultaneously function as a proscenium setting, as well as a site of knowledge production, research, mediation, contemplation, reception, and really active production? That all, of course, being tied in to the moment that, and here I'm going through Bourdieu, Hantelmann, that within the exhibition space, it's a social and historical valorization of that process, of the work, of the object, whether existent, ephemeral or not. At that moment, it's authorized and valorized by society to be what it is, art, and it authorizes itself to kind of also display the network around it. So that, of course, also then plays a role in all these questions of various medias. Going to jump into a bunch of examples, of course, historical examples you will more than well know that are important for many different types of practices and histories coming together within these performance-based practices. Variations 5, which was broadcasted live in '65 on German TV, with Cunningham and the dancers in the background, where you also, in the live transmission, see the production of the work, the material amassment, so to say, that spans behind it. 9 Evenings, which of course was also iconic for this, and really this moment, and that's why I'm showing this, because of course each of these images has produced numerous books and talks and references, again, always lives from that tension of its authenticity, but immediate or simultaneous, if you want, reproduction. And so, of course, there's also this game with the gaze that we're still fascinated by, that has become such a fetishist item, and we're in this conference in this certain instance are even part of this, because of course with the video you can, the great thing about video was that you didn't need time to reproduce it. You could show the reproduction at the same time as the event happened, but you as a performer could never look yourself into the eye. Montreal, Quebec had La Groupe Fusion at the same time, very active also in new media. I just want to show that this is not only in New York where this happened, this also happened, of course, in many different places in the world. Expo in '67, Les Groupes Fusion des Arts, Scène de spectacle et les mécaniques, Pavillon de la Jeunesse. So there's always this moment. There's Maurice Demers with works. in this case, femme. You can make references and links in a very different media way when you come back to painting with Carolee Schneemann, exploring that gaze, but not just the material agency that one could have working with these massment of material stepping out of the body of the painting as a woman, as the muse, but also of its mediation. In this case, interior scroll. And of course, what's always important is that it was a scripted event, that there were photographers around. It was not just done once. You could see it several times. It breaks down all these kind of myths and ephemeralities, and there's many pictures, and when it's exposed now, it's often in the tableau of various images. So there's, again, not only one image, but many. As an example, again, intermedia arts, of course, in Vancouver and was extremely important. History of intermedia, Western Front in the early 70s. So a moment where, and that's why I'm showing some of these images, where not just the recording and reproduction of these events was important, but also its presentation within a larger context and using the medium as a way to also break through the message of it. As spectacular events, Miss Idea, General Idea pageant, 71, of course, with many also political, and I think that's very important not to forget. It's not just the capacity of using this media, but of course the reasons why this was used. And this is also, of course, from emancipatory movements, from the gay rights movement to actually question statuses of gender and beauty and aesthetics. And just to question Dan Graham working in NASDAQ at this time, 71, experiments with the camera, again, being held from one side to the other. This is a very nice picture because it's not just the woman that's naked, but also the man, which is always good. And, and again, that camera in the foreground. As a trained classical art historian, this is the Erzählfigur. It's the narrative figure in the front of the image that frames and lets us also become part of that image. So for classic art, these kind of there's certain moments and compositionary moments that keep on. Videoscape, extremely important exhibition curated by Peggy Begale in 73, with a long list of international artists. Here, the question of Mexico, this question of the local, the nationalist, you get money to do new media, new incentives, but then it has to be Canadian, or I'm from Vienna, Austria, and I think we all suffer under these things, and play around them in various ways. I just wanted to show some of these images of catalogs and means of diffusion, and I think there is an interesting tension in it, of course, because they frame one moment, and a moment that was also very important for artists such as Vera Frankel, who did the first, one of the first live transmitted projects with Bell in Canada, where she actually had, in Montreal and in Toronto, Vera Frankel is a multidisciplinary artist who lives in Toronto, who lived in Montreal for a very long time. She's shown internationally, and in this case, in this early work in 74, she created a closed circuit installation, performance-based process, but also an exhibition that came out right afterwards. And that's actually an interesting point, where she made this session at the Bell Canada teleconferencing studios in Montreal-Chianto with playback at the Galerie 5 in Montreal. This is the invite. This is the artist at work. I always love these things, the art in front of the archive, looking through opacity, transparency. I mean, things that are really also then in its historization of these works, and I guess that's also where I want to get at. It's the way artists not just talk about their work, but also how they're shown in the images of their work. So, Dia looking through the screen, right? I mean, or the beginning image of John Jonas rolled up in a ball in front of the illumination of a monitor. I mean, there's these extremely strong image-based icons that then, of course, come back. And the equipment, of course, right? And in this case, this emancipatory moment of a woman in front of all this equipment. And its exhibition. And so that's an interesting moment where that intensity of a production is then translated back into that exhibition. And the exhibition, in this case, the way it's photographed at least, really becoming a kind of almost classical mise en scène and a theater piece where, you're born from the left and you die on the right when you leave. And this is how it was shown then in 74, and this is then how the documentation of it was shown by an excellent show by Sylvie Lacerte, who's one of the main scholars on Vera Frankel, I would say worldwide, and she then made an exhibition of all her project at SBC Gallery in Montreal. And there were, so to say, the dispositif of how conceptual art is presented since the late 90s has again been translated back into the exhibition. So very different in the thinking of the theatrical set than the more abstract set. Robert Racine playing Vexation by Eric Satie 840 times at Vehicule Gallery, a gallery, again that camera recording the work. That was then a gallery that was based on a collective, which is another important notion. And I'm going to stop after Susie Lake because I think it's probably, I'm overpassing my time. I don't know how I am with time. Am I? You're okay. I'm okay still, but I'm going ahead. Discussion, exactly. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to go a little bit more into Susie Lake, even though there's so many examples, of course, we could all cite on this. And Susie Lake is an artist that lives in Toronto. She did very seminal early multimedia performance conceptual-based works. One of the events, Bisecting Space, which was an event-based work, which we now can have accessible as images and through her voice talking about it, was really an idea. It was like an installation video work that tested the phenomena of the dotted line. In that sense, really going through her studio in terms, and that's interesting, in terms of breaking a space into two. So what are those two halves, right? Is one where the action takes place? Is the other half where the spectator is kind of hors champ? Is it inside the frame, outside of the frame? But this framing isn't in the two-dimensional. It's actually goes back into the three-dimensional of her space. So she says, to see if I could divide my studio into two spaces, and then with fabric to break up the notion of time and space within that exhibition. So it's not, of course, we see it now as reproduction, as in our process of historization, but in that instance, to actually break a space through the gesture of the line. And this is then acted out in a different way, where that body walks through that line, where she asked in 72 people to walk over paper in her studio, and she would have them keep the stay in the traces of the footsteps. So the shifts of those very minute movements would not so much leave of a bigger marking, but it would be the struggle to keep the line, that separating line of the body imprinted into the space, which I find is an interesting. And she also says in the beginning in these parts, in these practices, she didn't have a video camera yet because obviously equipment expensive, and so some of it she filmed with 8mm, and so like there was this faking the medium almost in those some of these early processes. Here is another piece where you can see the struggle of that, minute struggles. Another work is Box Concert, which is a videotape which is distributed for V-Tape in Toronto. It's 5 minutes, 74. Susie Lake lifts a long, thin, rectangular box from its position along the ground to a position on top of the table in a simple movement. I'm reading this now. Obviously, this is a citation from Susie Lake. Marks the horizontal and vertical planes of the monitor. This is being filmed, and this is how the work is shown. And is one translating the concept of minimalist music into an equivalent of visual language. And this 1 minute action is edited to repeat over a period of 5 minutes. And the 5-minute tape, in turn, was originally played as a continuous loop. So it's this mocking of a kind of phallic movement, obviously, of this very, young female artist lifting a huge, long, rectangular box from a table to the ground and back again. So there's, of course, this irony that also plays with this power relationship within the studio of what you produce. You could link it to Brancusi, the endless sculpture, etc. So, but there's a transition. And there's really a transition from watching the figure repeat this activity to then watching that activity because of its repetition and looping, breaking up within the space. And then again, as it's being presented in the corner on the floor, on a monitor, as the artist has presented it. I'm sure it's been probably presented in different ways since then to kind of show. And I'd like to, there was another video where she then rolled herself up in 676 in that line that separated her studio, and she was the choreography of the dotted line, and so then she would struggle within that dotted line wrapped around her, and it's the minute movements of that struggle again, of that contraptment that would then be reflected. And Barbara Fisher has spoken about this performance also playing out the question of how much institutional viewing time female artists got at the time? You know, were they shown in institutions, or was it more kind of the home studio effect, the kitchen as a lab, etc.? We all know there's iconic works around that. So I think there's this tension that's also embodied in the use of that type of material of viewing. And the last example is her work, Choreographed Puppets, where she, in a studio, built a kind of stage. And she then decided to have friends, in this case 2 male friends. I'm not sure if she also, she was dressed up like a Thanksgiving turkey, as she says, and then she was kind of pulled by strings, like a puppet. This was never a performance that was done publicly at that time. It was made for video, it was photographed. The beautiful prints have been exhibited. But she was, of course, as the strings were being pulled, she was, and this is nice going to Vera Franco and Screen Games, of course, she pulled back, and it kind of also made the limits of her body within that framing that mirrors the video again. And here it is as an image. That's how it was exposed at the University Gallery. But then, and this is kind of countering it when you say, how do curators deal with bringing these works back sometimes, and artists themselves in collaboration, that it would be reperformed. And of course that does something very different to and without any valorization of better or not. What's important about it is that it becomes a different instance of awareness that's kind of captured within the exhibition space. And that tension as a political and social space has just shifted over the many years of what it used to be to become a space of encounter. I'm going to stop here with this last image of Lisa Steele with her iconic video Birthday Suit with Scars and Defects, where she on her 27th birthday decided to do a tape that chronicled her passage through time. And I've always been clumsy, tripping, dropping, falling with alarming regularity, and this tape accepts the extent of the consequences. And I think this acceptance of consequences is an engagement with it, is what's at the key of many of these practices. Thank you.
Thanks so much for a great presentation. One question I have to start off is how these changes in reading of practices actually affect how the works are being shown. Because I absolutely agree with you that we, of course, keep reinterpreting and reading in different ways, which leads to a different kind of knowledge production over time. So there might be a shift from putting emphasis on the body to a shift to discursive practice, and that characterizes decades, whatever. However, looking at some of the images where works were then and now neatly displayed in vitrines, shut off from the audience, how much of that shift in reading actually manifests in the staging of the exhibition? I think it does in new media art, but very often in the works that you have shown even, we seem to be stuck in similar presentation modes.
Yes, I would even go further. I think it actually even goes even more retro, you know, in that sense, where there's a kind of fetishization of a kind of, I don't even know if it's really an original or authentic, but kind of conceptual display where you would have the same kind of even vitrine format, flat table, modernist furniture. It's kind of a nostalgian effect of that, and the simple line. And I know in Austria and Germany in the 90s we had Informationskunst, information art, and if you framed something on the wall, you were like, oh my God, you're adding to the market value. You have to pin this on the wall. I think there's various different modes how it comes back, but of course you can't. It's hard to generalize, but I think there is a push, specifically when artists engaged in long research in collaboration with these artists, try, historically important artists, feminist practices, try to break that mold. So I think there's trying to read these scripts differently through either dissemination of not having that material become accessible, getting it out of the vitrine, making not fanzines, but booklets that people can take away in a very literal sense, publishing it online, you know, putting out the PDF of the publication back then online so people can actually download it. I think there's a way of how that moment of knowledge transfer surpasses the exhibition. There'll always be exhibitions that will kind of have a more conservative ring to it. But I do think that because of the foundation of certain of performance department, but well, within the institutions, people are aware of the ongoing changes of the work. So I think there'll be a slipping out of it again. What sometimes does happen is that when artists from the 70s, and I've seen this with Carolee Schneemann, I also feel with Susie Lake, there's also, of course, an insistence of how will an artist want her work, and I say her consciously, to be represented within a museum. And sometimes one also has to accept that maybe that artist wants her work to be exhibited in a very classical and, kind of following a conceptual display. I think that's the same thing. But I think there's other tendencies too.
Thanks. Questions for Barbara specifically?
It's been a question that's been on my mind in the last 2 days, and I just want to have your
oh my God.
reflection. No, in terms of, but I sense it in this panel, and I think there are some resonance, and hence I ask, is the presence or the possibility of the domestic and the personal in the space of technology. Because I sense that in your presentation. I would like your response on it as well, in terms of where you're looking at dissemination and transmission of technology as a very human activity in terms of knowledge and education, and you're sort of teaching or making that person enabled to use technology. So this this shift of humanizing technique and looking at the quiet, the personal, and again, the sentimental quality of it. I just want some reflections. It'll be nice to have your reflections on it.
I mean, I feel it's very tricky because on one hand, of course, you have, you have Martha Rosler doing her kitchen performance in a video, right? And it's not about her saying this is really great to work in my kitchen. I'm actually loving this. This is so fantastic. She's of course making a very critical statement about it. And it's also interesting at the same time when you have a curator say about somebody like Susie Lake that person, didn't want to have all that fuss around for the exhibition. She wanted to keep the privacy of her studio, which of course is also a bit questionable because who doesn't want to be shown? I mean, I just don't believe that artists don't want to be shown and they don't want anybody to care. We all want to have that, right? So I don't believe that. But it's a politic behind it, and that's, of course, the politics of the ephemeral, which is a very tricky thing, again, too, because it was a good way of keeping a lot of minorities and female artists, non-white heterosexual artists, basically, safe within their status of the principal body of artists, and kept everybody out because they were doing ephemeral anti-institutional art. They didn't want to be part of it. So I think there is that ephemerality, but I think there's a politic behind a lot of this that is extremely important not to mix up with in that claim of authenticity. And I think the kitchen and that private space plays a part of that, personally. I believe that. I don't know.
Adding to that quickly, I think there also has been a profound shift in how we construct these spaces, just in the media age we live in the age of Web 2.0 and broadcasting yourself and everybody having potentially the camera into their bedroom. So how these spaces intersect, the personal and the public, has radically changed for us.
I don't have an answer, but I was thinking that I came from a very traditional formation discipline, art conservation. We don't deal with artists; they are all dead. We deal with obsolete objects. But then I started doing my PhD in a performance department, and I was impressed that they don't care about objects, but about way of transmittance, and they always use the body and orally things, and they want to embody the knowledge. And that's what I make this relation with media art in Mexico. We have to do it the same way, with the body, with the action, because there are not objects. And I've been taking some workshops with these media artists, and they're very human. They want to touch the Arduino, all this technological stuff, but they are always touching. They want to hear Even they are super digital, they have this, listen the machine, yeah, it's working. So it's all that things you learn, and it's very interesting for a conservator to learn that for them, there is a materiality there, a body that has to speak, to move in the DJs or the sound artists, they move in a specific way, and all the stuff is missing from the archives. So it is interesting for us to use this idea of artistic pattern, because it's to put together all these things, even the postures of the performer, the way that objects work, because usually media art has been focusing only in the functioning of this computer. It works the same. It is being emulated. Like, it is everything for the artist working with an emulated computer, but it's also the body somehow. So it has to be human, at least for me, or in this context.
Yeah.
I think Chris had a question. I see his silhouette.
Yeah, is this on? Probably not. I can scream. I have a stumbling question. No, it's there.
There you go. Now it is.
I have a stumbling question. Maybe it's more just an observation, and it's something that Jose Carlos and I have been talking about. And it does relate very much to Srajana and also Barbara's presentation about absence. And it's this question about this gap between image, description, imagination, and affect. Jose Carlos and I were talking about this idea that when in these images and these of performances and of events that are multisensory, that cannot be actually even captured by images, and then the writing around those images in an art historical way. And I encountered this very much. It's interesting seeing the Variations 5 image again, because of course I use that in Entangled. I encountered this so much in Entangled, writing about performances which were so complex and so dense and so experiential in the body that I never experienced. And then in text I have to try to reimagine, you know, and not recreate, but reimagine somehow. And the thing is that the image, the absent, and I felt this in the Gupta image too, of this heat. You know, it's like something I can imagine, but I have always this disappointment that I have not been there. And so it's very interesting when you deal with these very, very complex works, performative works that, especially like something like Variations 5 or EAT, where you have this imagination of what those works were. And then in fact, if you see the video of EAT, it's like, oh my God, you know, this was not particularly interesting because you weren't there. You weren't there. Your body wasn't there. And also, in fact, your body now is not the same social, political body that it watched that at the Armory, you know, in 1966. And so it's always this aesthetics of disappointment that Oren Katz and Ian Atzuri talk about biological art that way, but it's also this. And so I don't know, absence is really something which is coming up a lot in this conference, and the question, the politics of experience of how we deal with that absence in writing a history. So.
Yeah, something that you said yesterday, Chris added something very interesting that regarding the politics of absence also, that perhaps in the 60s or 70s we were exposed to all these equipments. It was easy to see what equipment, what apparatus were performing, but today, in the last 15, 20 years, due to digitalization, they're all black boxed. So there is also this absence of the performing technology that sometimes was also important in terms of the performance as such, or even the historical documentation of something. So I was seeing Guptas and everything is black boxed in what I mean, it's very emotional, but at the same time the technology is hidden. So I think that adds a lot to what you were saying.
Yeah, also to pick up on that. First of all, I think it's important to remember that you focused on one specific aspect of absence, and of course you can broaden that history. And if you go back to deconstruction and Derrida and the presence of absence that comes out of the 60s and that very same era, so it was connected from the beginning. Then we are, and I'm not trying to diminish your argument here in any way, but we are of course looking at this phenomenon throughout the history of art. You know, we weren't there for the cave paintings. Oh no, we're discovering they're actually animations because, you know, the torches were moving. So we're always struggling with the same problem from a different, from a very different perspective. Sometimes I even think that it's good that the photograph is a static moment that has no illusion about what you're missing in it. Somehow videos are even more problematic because they pretend to give you an idea of it, but still your body wasn't there, and there's a different kind of falsification in the process. So
Totally.
it's like, there also was another question
Should
somewhere,
I
but go
just
ahead.
ad hoc to
Yeah.
that? I think, Chris, that struggle or the question around that struggle, is this I experience it, is of course always with, we know that as an historian, I mean, that would be ridiculous if as historians or researchers we had to be there to be able to get it. And even if you would, I think very few people actually would. I have had this so many times that people who were witnesses of performances say, this is absolutely wrong. This wasn't at all like this. So there's a question of authorship of witnessing, which is a different one, right? But I think there is a nostalgia aligned to a lot of these aesthetics and the choice of images. And you know, when you see a bunch of bad performance photographs, you know how constructed the images we are left with are. That we're working with historically with events, because of course there were hundreds of them. And the other thing is, I feel that there's a, you know, even artists reuse their own documentation. I mean, Carolee Schneemann did this whole series where she said, my original documentation at a brief moment at the React Feminism in Berlin, where I don't want this old documentation of my work ever to be used again, and I want this to be, now it has to be reworked, and then it's the real thing. And I mean, there's so many layers to that, I absolutely agree, and who knows.
It's also not, thank you, it's not just the not there, we know that, but it's also the body, like, of this, I mean, something kind of multisensorial, like the body wanting to kind of understand that, you know,
Yeah.
but again, being at a loss to, you know, that's the strange gap that happens.
Yeah, but in fact, I'm just looking at absence as an opportunity for complete possibility and potential, and because our body is essentially yearning and moving towards wanting that experience, we will have an experience in some way or the other, and that experience is as valid as there is no original experience. Because that way I mean, I'm sorry, like, I'm sort of, sometimes I'm critical of history as that, like teleological, like chronological history, because that way, I mean, experience and history are entangled in strange ways. Sorry, this just crossed my mind, but I don't know if you can experience history. How do you experience history if not through an excuse and an image? So absence, not as not being there, but absence as a possible, as a very political potential tool of, you know, silence, absence, not reacting, not acting, but instead an imagination as an inevitability. You know, we will imagine, and our imaginations are valid. And yeah.
There's another question. Okay. Any final questions?
It was actually more like a comment following on building on Chris and Jose and everything that has been said, and it's really how Barbara, for your presentation, how really nourishing media are histories, and how we understand the practices that we've been talking about for 4 decades, really get nourished by bringing on discussions, concepts, approaches from performance studies, disability studies, without making a big deal about multidisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity, just moving beyond the box that even has been built around technology, around cybernetics, and trying to understand what is it that we do with the tools that have been there, with the ideas that have circulated, and the production of body art and all these different ways in which the body has always been there, even with technology. So I'm pointing out something I noticed, that is like we are moving out of media art histories by bringing on all of these disciplines, and I think that's a good sign to make connections that have always been there. Thank you.
We might finish. So thanks a lot to all the presenters.